Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep on a true crime case that's already caught your eye, the double homicide of Pamela and Helen Hargan.
Oh, yeah, it's a tough one.
You shared a podcast episode with us, and
A wild one?
it's a wild one. A wealthy D.C. suburb, a seemingly perfect family, and then,
Oh,
boom, tragedy.
what makes this case so interesting is that it really throws you for a loop.
Yeah.
We're going to be examining how the investigators had to kind of navigate all these twists and turns, really peeling back the layers of family secrets, financial fraud, to ultimately find the killer.
So picture this. A sweltering July afternoon in 2017, McLean, Virginia. Police get a 911 call leading them to a stunning discovery at the Hargan home.
Mm-hmm.
Pamela, the mother, is found dead on the first floor.
Yeah.
Gunshot wounds to the head. Then officers find her daughter Helen in an upstairs bathroom, also deceased from a gunshot wound. A rifle's lying nearby.
So the initial reaction is murder-suicide.
Of course.
Open and shut case, right? But that's when Detective Byerson enters the scene, and he starts noticing things that don't quite add up.
Like what made him question that initial murder-suicide theory?
Well, for one, the crime scene itself was unusually neat. Helen's cell phone, found in the bathroom, was completely clean. No fingerprints, smudges, no blood. You'd think that with a violent struggle, there'd be some trace of evidence on something so personal.
It's like finding a perfectly polished shoe in the middle of a mud pit. It just feels out of place.
Exactly. And then there's the rifle.
Right.
It was right next to Helen,
Mm.
but practically spotless.
Mm.
No blood splatter, no tissue, things you'd absolutely expect to see on a weapon fired at such close range.
Right.
These discrepancies, while subtle, are often the key to unraveling a complex case like this. They're like whispers amidst the chaos, urging investigators to look closer.
So fascinating how these tiny details can be so crucial. So once that murder-suicide theory is in question, where do investigators turn their attention?
They start digging into the lives of Pamela and Helen, trying to uncover any hidden tensions, secrets, or motives.
Okay.
And that's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
Pamela Hargan was a successful businesswoman who raised her three daughters, Ashley, Megan, and Helen, as a single mother.
Oh.
She was known for being incredibly generous with her daughters, particularly when it came to their finances.
Was that generosity ever a source of tension in the family?
That's a great question. I think it's important to consider the psychological impact of that constant financial support. Did it foster a sense of entitlement or perhaps even resentment in any of the daughters? It's a question worth pondering.
Definitely adds another layer to the investigation.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Helen. The podcast mentioned she had recently graduated from college and was dating a guy named Carlos.
Right. And her relationship with Carlos seemed to be a point of contention with Pamela.
Okay.
She hadn't even met him, but she was concerned about his influence on Helen. It was classic mother-daughter friction,
Yeah.
amplified perhaps by the fact that Pamela was so involved in her daughters' lives.
Yeah, so investigators must have initially considered that this conflict could have been the catalyst for a horrific argument, potentially leading to the murders.
Absolutely. It's a natural path to explore.
Right.
But then there's another element that throws a wrench in things. Megan, Pamela's middle daughter.
Okay.
She was actually at the house the morning of the murders, along with her 5-year-old daughter.
And that immediately makes her a person of interest, right? Especially since there were no signs of forced entry.
It certainly does.
Yeah.
Now remember, this is a large house in a quiet neighborhood.
Right.
No one reported hearing gunshots.
Right.
So if Megan's account of leaving the house before the murders is accurate,
Yeah.
it means the killer was either already inside or had access.
It's a classic locked room mystery with the added layer of family drama. What was Megan's story exactly? What did she tell investigators?
She claims she was packing to leave for West Virginia with her daughter when she saw Helen on the porch,
Okay.
visibly upset
Mm.
and talking on the phone. It seemed like Helen was arguing with Carlos.
Okay, so there's that potential Carlos connection again. Did Megan provide any more details about Helen's behavior that morning?
She said Helen was crying and mentioned something about Pamela being in her office with the door closed.
Right.
But then Megan claims she left with her daughter,
Okay.
leaving Helen and Pamela alone in the house. And here's where things get even more suspicious.
You're about to tell me there's more. I'm on the edge of my seat. What else did investigators uncover about Megan?
Just a day before the murders, she filed a suspicious persons report with the police.
Oh.
She described seeing two men she thought were casing the neighborhood, acting suspiciously. She even said she went down to the basement and brought her husband's rifle upstairs for safety.
Wait a minute, that's the same rifle found next to Helen's body, right?
That's right. So was this report a genuine concern for her family's safety? Or was it a calculated move to set up an alibi? It's a question that loomed large over the entire investigation.
Yeah.
It really did.
It's like she's laying the groundwork for a story where an intruder breaks in and commits the murders. Talk about chilling foresight, if that's what it was. But we haven't even gotten to the most shocking part yet.
Right.
The 911 call didn't come from inside the house or even from anyone in the neighborhood.
You're absolutely right. The call came from hundreds of miles away from Carlos, Helen's boyfriend.
In Texas.
In Texas.
Whoa, that's a curveball. How does a boyfriend in Texas become the one to alert the police to a potential double homicide in Virginia?
It turns out he was on the phone with Helen that morning,
Okay.
and their conversation took a dark turn. Helen confided in Carlos that Megan had confessed to killing their mother.
Oh my gosh. Imagine the shock, the helplessness.
Yeah.
You're miles away on the phone and you hear something like that? What do you even do?
It must have been terrifying for Carlos.
Yeah.
He spent almost an hour trying to convince Helen to leave the house or call for help herself.
Right.
He begged her to call 911, but for some reason she refused.
It's hard to fathom what could have been going through her mind at that point. Maybe disbelief, maybe fear for her niece's safety. We can only speculate, but ultimately, that inaction had devastating consequences.
Yeah. When the line went silent, Carlos knew something was terribly wrong. He desperately tried calling Helen back, but she didn't answer.
Of course.
That's when he decided to call 911 himself, even though he was all the way in Texas.
Wow, what a frantic situation. Did he reach the right authorities quickly?
Unfortunately, no.
Oh, no.
He ended up calling various emergency services, trying to explain the situation and provide the correct address in Virginia. It must have been incredibly frustrating for him, trying to convey the urgency of the situation across state lines.
It's a reminder of how, even in our hyper-connected world, things can go wrong, and crucial minutes can be lost in a crisis. So, how did the investigators react to Carlos's story? I imagine they were initially skeptical, given the distance and the fact that Megan had painted him in a negative light.
They were definitely cautious. It's natural to question the motives of someone so far removed from the situation.
Yeah.
They had to consider whether he was trying to protect Helen by shifting the blame onto her sister.
But there must have been something about his account, coupled with the inconsistencies at the crime scene, that made them take his story more seriously.
Yeah.
What was it that really shifted their focus onto Megan?
The forensic evidence regarding Helen's gunshot wound was a game changer.
Okay.
The trajectory of the bullet completely debunked the suicide theory.
Okay.
Remember, the initial assumption was that Helen shot her mother and then herself.
Right, but if the bullet trajectory didn't align with a self-inflicted wound, what did that indicate?
The medical examiner's report stated that the bullet entered through the top of Helen's head and exited through the bottom.
Okay.
This would have been incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for her to do to herself, especially with the type of rifle found at the scene. It simply didn't add up.
So if Helen didn't shoot herself, who did? And why would Megan, her own sister, do such a thing?
Well, as investigators delved deeper into Megan's life, they discovered a potential motive, and it all revolved around money.
Of course. It seems like money is at the root of so many crimes.
Yeah.
What did they find out about Megan's finances?
Right in the thick of the investigation, Detective Byerson received a voicemail that changed everything.
Oh!
It was from the fraud department at Capital One Bank.
Okay.
They had been looking into suspicious activity on Pamela Hargan's accounts and reached out to the detective thinking it might be relevant to his case.
What kind of suspicious activity? Were there unauthorized withdrawals or something?
It was even more brazen than that. The day before the murders, someone pretending to be Pamela had called the bank and tried to wire over $400,000 out of her account.
Hold on. Are you saying someone was trying to steal from Pamela just hours before she was killed?
That's exactly what it seemed like.
Gee.
As a security measure, the bank called Pamela back to confirm the transaction. She was frantic.
Right.
She vehemently denied authorizing any transfers and was clearly worried that someone was trying to access her money.
That's chilling. It's like someone knew their time was running out. But did they have any leads on who made that fraudulent call?
The bank had recorded the calls as per standard procedure.
Okay.
When the investigators listened to them, their jaws dropped.
What?
The voice impersonating Pamela was crystal clear, and they immediately recognized it. It was Megan.
So not only was Megan a person of interest due to her presence at the crime scene, but now they have evidence connecting her to attempted financial fraud against her own mother. That's
It
huge.
was a major turning point in the investigation,
Wow.
and it gets even more bizarre.
Okay.
The bank also had security footage from one of their branches showing Megan there in person, trying to sort things out with her mother's account.
Okay.
What really struck the investigators was what she was wearing that day.
I have to ask, what could be more incriminating than trying to fraudulently wire money? Was she wearing a disguise or something?
Not quite a disguise, but equally telling, she was wearing a T-shirt with the word cash splashed across the front.
Seriously.
It was almost comical if the circumstances weren't so tragic.
It's like something out of a dark comedy sketch. The irony is almost too much to bear.
It does feel like a screenwriter's invention, doesn't it? But the reality was deadly serious.
Right.
With this new evidence, the investigators had a strong motive, and they were closing in on Megan.
So did they arrest her right away?
Not immediately.
Okay.
They wanted to build an airtight case,
Right.
leaving no room for reasonable doubt.
Okay.
Remember, they were still relying heavily on circumstantial evidence. They needed more. So they invited Megan down to the police station for an interview, ostensibly to get DNA samples and fingerprints.
Right.
And surprisingly, she agreed to come in.
It takes a certain kind of confidence, or perhaps a stunning lack of awareness, to walk into a police station knowing you're a suspect in a double homicide investigation.
She definitely underestimated the investigators. What began as a routine interview turned into a 4.5-hour interrogation.
Oh, wow. What was their strategy? Did they confront her right away with the evidence?
They were more subtle than that.
Okay.
They started by letting her talk, hoping she'd reveal incriminating details or contradict her previous statements.
A classic interrogation technique.
Yeah.
Let the suspect dig their own hole. Did it work?
To a degree.
Okay.
Initially, Megan stuck to her story,
Okay.
claiming that it was actually her mother who made those fraudulent bank calls.
Uh-huh.
But when confronted with the recordings of those calls,
Right.
her facade started to crumble.
Did she finally crack and confess to everything?
She did admit that it was her voice on the recordings,
Okay.
but she insisted she was just acting on her mother's behalf.
So she confessed to the fraud but not the murders? Did the investigators buy her story?
Not for a second.
Okay.
She then tried to weave a new narrative, claiming that her mother had promised to buy a house for her and her husband, just like she had for her other daughters. She even tried to back it up by presenting a proof of funds document.
Did the document hold up under scrutiny? It seems like she was grasping at straws at this point.
It was a desperate attempt, and a poorly executed one at that.
Okay.
The document was clearly forged.
Uh-huh.
Plus, the investigators already had evidence that contradicted her claims. They had the recordings of Pamela's panicked calls to the bank, where she explicitly denied any knowledge of the wire transfer requests.
Yeah.
Megan's carefully constructed web of lies was quickly unraveling.
They had her lying about the fraud, and they had her at the scene of the crime.
Right.
But they still needed that definitive link to the murders themselves.
Yeah.
What was the missing piece of the puzzle that would seal her fate?
The final nail in the coffin, so to speak, was the gunshot residue evidence.
Oh, of course.
Remember, everyone at the crime scene, including Megan, was swabbed for gunshot residue on the day of the murders.
Yep.
The results of those tests proved to be crucial.
And what did those tests reveal?
They showed that Megan had gunshot residue on both of her hands, while Helen had none. This completely destroyed the defense's suicide theory.
Right.
If Helen didn't fire the rifle, the only other person present at the time was Megan.
That's damning evidence. You can't argue with science. I imagine that with the fraudulent bank calls, the forged document, and now the gunshot residue, they finally had enough to arrest her.
They certainly had a mountain of evidence against her.
Right.
But instead of rushing to make an arrest, they decided to go a different route. They chose to pursue a grand jury indictment.
Why go that route? What advantage did a grand jury indictment offer them?
It was a strategic move.
Okay.
A grand jury indictment allowed them to bypass a preliminary hearing, which can give the defense a sneak peek at the prosecution's case and a chance to challenge the evidence early on.
Interesting. So it was a way to keep their cards close to their chest and prevent the defense from getting a head start on their strategy.
Exactly. Plus, they were confident that Megan wasn't a flight risk.
Right.
She'd been cooperating with the investigation so far.
Right.
And they knew they could easily track her down if she tried to run.
So the grand jury convened, reviewed the evidence. What was their decision?
They decided to indict Megan for the murders of both her mother and sister.
Wow.
as well as 2 counts of using a firearm in the commission of a felony. In November of 2018, over a year after the murders, Megan Hargan was finally arrested and taken into custody.
Justice delayed but not denied. What happened next? Did the case go to trial?
Yes, the trial began in 2022,
Okay.
almost 5 years after the murders.
Wow.
The prosecution presented a strong case,
Okay.
arguing that Megan was driven by greed and the fear of being caught for her financial crimes.
Right.
They meticulously laid out the evidence, the inconsistencies in Helen's supposed suicide, the forged documents, the fraudulent bank calls, and of course, that damning gunshot residue.
What was the defense's strategy? Did they try to explain away the evidence, or did they come up with an alternative theory?
The defense team was known for their tenacity.
Okay.
They argued that Helen, driven by depression and resentment toward her family, had killed Pamela and then staged a murder-suicide to frame Megan.
They're saying that Helen committed suicide after murdering her own mother and made it look like Megan did it. That seems far-fetched. How did they try to support that claim?
They tried to recreate Helen's supposed suicide using a technique called the toe-on-the-trigger method,
Okay.
claiming that she could have used a sock to avoid leaving fingerprints on the rifle.
But the forensic evidence already contradicted the suicide theory, right? Did the jury buy into the defense's explanation?
Not at all.
Okay.
The prosecution skillfully dismantled their argument,
Okay.
pointing out the implausibility of Helen staging such a scene, especially given her lack of any history of violence or mental instability. It was a desperate attempt to create reasonable doubt, but it ultimately failed.
So, after years of waiting and a grueling trial, was justice finally served? What was the verdict?
The jury deliberated for weeks, carefully considering all the evidence.
Right.
In the end, they found Megan Hargan guilty on both counts of first-degree murder.
Wow. That must have been a huge relief for the prosecution and, I imagine, for Ashley, the surviving daughter. What was the sentence?
The jury recommended life sentences for each murder conviction.
Oh.
They also added an additional 8 years for the 2 firearms charges to be served consecutively. It seemed like the case had finally reached its conclusion, but there was one final twist in store.
Oh, no, don't tell me there was mistrial. What happened?
You guessed it. A mistrial was declared due to juror misconduct.
What?
One of the jurors, intrigued by the defense's toe-on-the-trigger theory, had gone home and experimented with her own husband's rifle,
Oh, no.
trying to see if the defense's claims were physically possible.
That's a huge no-no.
Right.
Jurors are explicitly instructed not to conduct their own investigations or introduce outside information into the deliberations. How did this come to light?
She ended up sharing her findings with the other jurors,
Oh, jeez.
potentially influencing their decision-making process.
Yeah,
It was a clear violation of the rules, and the defense immediately jumped on it.
of course.
They argued that this misconduct had prejudiced the jury against Megan,
Right.
and they demanded a new trial.
So after all that, the case was back to square one. That must have been devastating for everyone involved.
It was a major setback, especially for Ashley.
Right.
She had already endured the unimaginable loss of her mother and sister, and now she had to face the prospect of reliving the entire ordeal all over again in a retrial.
Right.
The emotional toll must have been immense.
It's heartbreaking. But I imagine the prosecution, despite the frustration of the mistrial, was still determined to see the case through.
Absolutely. They were confident in their evidence and believed that justice would ultimately prevail.
So a retrial was scheduled. What was the prosecution's approach this time? Did they change their strategy?
They largely stuck with their original strategy,
Okay.
emphasizing the overwhelming evidence against Megan. The financial motive, the forged documents, the inconsistencies in Helen's gunshot wound, and of course the gunshot residue. They also presented powerful testimony from Carlos, Helen's boyfriend, who recounted that chilling phone call he received from Helen on the morning of the murders.
Did the defense stick with their Helen framed Megan theory?
They did.
Okay.
They continued to argue that Helen was the mastermind behind it all.
Right.
But their arguments seemed even less convincing in the second trial. They faced an uphill battle against a mountain of evidence.
And what about Megan? Did she take the stand this time?
No, she didn't testify in either trial.
Okay.
This might have raised questions in the minds of the jury, but ultimately the prosecution's case was simply too strong to overcome.
So after all the twists and turns, what was the final outcome of the second trial? So after all that another trial, more evidence presented, did the jury reach the same verdict?
They did. In September 2023, almost 6 years to the day after the murder. Megan Hargan was once again convicted on both counts of first-degree murder.
Oh,
There was no doubt this time, no juror misconduct. The evidence was overwhelming.
right.
The jury delivered a swift and unanimous verdict, guilty.
What a long and agonizing journey for everyone involved. What was Megan's sentence this time?
The judge sentenced her to 2 life sentences, one for each murder conviction to be served consecutively. On top of that, she received 8 years for the firearms charges also to be served consecutively.
Wow.
It's a harsh sentence, but one that reflects the severity of her crimes.
It's hard to grasp the depth of the betrayal and the pain that Ashley, the surviving daughter, must have gone through. She lost her entire immediate family and then had to come to terms with the fact that her own sister was responsible for their deaths.
It's almost impossible to comprehend. The podcast you shared really emphasized the emotional toll this case took on Ashley. She had to navigate not only the grief of losing her mother and sister, but also the shattering realization that the person she trusted, her own flesh and blood, was capable of such a horrific act.
It's a sobering reminder that the impact of these crimes extends far beyond the courtroom. While justice may have been served legally, the emotional wounds will likely last a lifetime.
What's fascinating to me, though, is how this case reveals the power of those small details, the seemingly insignificant things that can end up being crucial to an investigation.
You're right. If Detective Byerson hadn't noticed that clean cell phone or the lack of blood splatter on the rifle, the entire investigation could have gone in a completely different direction.
Absolutely. And then think about Carlos Helen's boyfriend calling 911 from Texas. If he hadn't been so persistent, if he just brushed off Helen's claims as being too outlandish, who knows how long it would have taken for someone to discover what had really happened at the Hargan home.
This deep dive has really been a masterclass in the importance of critical thinking, of paying attention to the details, and of never underestimating the ripple effect of our actions.
We often think of murder investigations as being solved with dramatic breakthroughs. DNA matches, surprise witnesses, confessions. But in this case, it was the slow, meticulous piecing together of seemingly insignificant details that ultimately led to the truth. It was about connecting the dots, recognizing patterns, and building a case brick by brick.
It's a testament to the dedication and persistence of the investigators. They spent years following every lead, analyzing every shred of evidence, and refusing to give up until they had uncovered the truth.
And let's not forget the courage of those who came forward with information like Carlos. Their willingness to speak up even when faced with doubt and scrutiny was essential to bringing justice for Pamela and Helen.
It's a tragic case, a story of family betrayal and unimaginable loss. But within that darkness, there's also a glimmer of hope. The hope that even in the face of such horrific acts, the truth will eventually emerge and justice will prevail.
This deep dive has really delved into the complexities of human nature, the fragility of family bonds, and the lengths that some people will go to for money and power.
It certainly leaves you with a lot to ponder. What's your final takeaway for our listeners today? What do you hope they'll think about after this deep dive?
I think this case, as tragic as it is, offers a powerful reminder that even in the most seemingly perfect families, secrets can lurk beneath the surface. It's a reminder to be observant, to trust your instincts, and to never be afraid to ask questions. After all, sometimes the most shocking truths are hidden in plain sight, just waiting to be discovered.
That's a thought-provoking way to end this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, stay curious.